For the past 15 years, I've been living and working here in Europe, helping businesses shape their leadership strategies for the future, most recently with my current company, Xynteo. I'm originally from the US, the land of opportunity, but I'm here today to argue that our focus on opportunities is killing us, and that problems are the future. A few years ago, I had a conversation with Lieutenant General Graham Lamb, who, now retired, formerly commanded the UK's Special Forces. This was at the peak of ISIS, and when I asked him what he thought about the global security situation, his immediate and I thought counterintuitive reply was this: I could not care less about security. I'm interested in stability. Stability is what allows societies to flourish, quality of life to improve. We can experience great things. Thanks to stability, we are more prosperous now than ever before. Global GDP per capita has grown 5-fold over the last century. 40 years ago, over 40% of the global population lived in extreme poverty. Today, that number is less than 10%, and it continues to fall. The late Hans Rosling, a revered Swedish professor and TED celebrity, was correct in saying that there is much to celebrate. His life's work was to make visible the dramatic, sustained improvements in things like child mortality and life expectancy. These great shifts did not happen by mistake. So when we apply ourselves, we can make big things happen, and leaders make that possible. That all said, look around, and you see signs that the progress we've gotten used to may be thinning out. Here are 3. 36 million millionaires, it's less than 1% of the global population, command 46% of the world's wealth, while 3.5 billion people command just 2.7% of the wealth in the world. More than 1/3 of the food produced in the world today, and close to 40% in developing nations, is wasted, either in the supply chain or by us, consumers, before it can be eaten. I really like this one. Only around 1% of all raw materials for production remain in use 6 months after the point of purchase. 1%. So in other words, our way of life depends on taking things that have sometimes taken millions of years to form, and then after only a handful of uses, discarding them by burying them in toxic landfills, dumping them on the land or in the sea. So if you look a little below the surface, our model looks fragile. It looks, I would argue, obsolete, not up to the task of delivering the stability required to support the well-being of the 9.8 billion people the UN expects to live on the planet in 2050. And of course, as our population grows, as technology weaves the world more and more tightly together, the challenges get larger and they get more complex. They get wicked. So finding our way through this new reality and building a saner and more inclusive economic model will require perhaps the best leadership the world has ever seen. When faced with challenges like the ones I've mentioned, resource pressures, inequality, etc., we typically look to governments for solutions. And it's true that governments are critical partners in these endeavors. But I was absolutely floored to learn that of the 100 largest economic entities on the planet, 67 are corporations. So only 33 are governments or nations, and some of them are US states like California. So what a stark illustration of the role business leaders, not just government leaders, need to play in building economies that are fit for the 21st century. So how can business leaders engage effectively with all of this, while also thriving in the marketplace? My hypothesis is that leaders need to rethink the way they generate value. My hypothesis, as I said at the start, is that business leaders need to stop focusing on opportunities and start focusing on problems. In 2012, while working with a team of up-and-coming leaders at a global energy firm, I had a conversation with the man then leading Boeing Ventures, effectively Boeing's skunk works. I asked him what shift he wanted to see in his leaders in Boeing. I found his answer surprising, and it's stuck with me ever since. I want my people, he said, to stop focusing on chasing opportunities. Opportunities are easy to see. Everybody chases them, and then has to wrestle for the biggest piece of the pie at the finish line. And he went on. Problems, on the other hand, problems are not zero-sum. Work on problems, and you're no longer dividing the pie, you're making it bigger. I want my people, he said, thinking about the problems that affect many people's lives. Companies like ours can work on problems of that scale for generations. So problems, I thought, that's interesting, and it's counterintuitive, and it's even a little bit sacrilegious in business. Opportunity is one of the words we use most often. So when I first suggested to my CEO that we just outright ban the word opportunity, he looked at me like I had completely lost my mind, like I was speaking another language. But it slowly started to catch on. So in the last few years, Xynteo has become increasingly focused on working at what we call the intersection, applying commercial muscle to human problems, to problems that affect very many people's lives. So we believe that this could be where the biggest potential for future growth lies. So I'm keen to share some examples of business leaders trying to put this problem-driven growth into practice. But before I do that, I'd like to mention two of the barriers that sometimes hold them back. The first is a reluctance to deviate from core business and core capabilities. So you might think of yourself as a company that makes toothpaste or turbines or mobile phones, right? But your value as a company comes only partly from your product. Most of your value as a company is likely to be embodied in other assets, your brand, your relationship with your customers, your ability to innovate, your culture. So think of IBM, who over very many decades transformed from a company that made hardware, big, bulky mainframe computers at one stage, to a provider of business services. Its CEO, Ginny Rometty, said it really well. Never protect your past, and never define yourself as a single product. So that was the first barrier. Here's the second. The second barrier stopping leaders from putting problems at the heart of their businesses is the tendency of large companies to be so focused on the internal workings of their company and industry that they miss many of the clues on how the external world is changing. This can lead companies to continue to invest in and protect products that are losing relevance, and thereby missing the chance to apply cash and human capital to problems their customers need solved. Well-worn examples like Kodak, Nokia, and now Volkswagen show us the price of pulling down the blinds when times get tough. So in order to reap the rewards of focusing on problems, business leaders need to overcome two barriers. First, they need to avoid identifying themselves with the product. And second, they need to check in constantly with how the world is changing beyond their company and industry walls. So now two examples. My first example is Statoil, the national oil company in Norway. And I know there must be some people in the audience who think that it's really interesting that I'm bringing up an oil company as an example here. Stick with me, I think this is a very good one. So Statoil is a Fortune 40 oil and gas company with annual revenues of around $60 billion US. In the 1960s, Norway was one of the poorest countries in Europe and perhaps pretty far down on the list in the world. But thanks to its oil and gas resources and to the efforts of Statoil, Norway is one of the wealthiest countries in the world today. So it's little wonder that Statoil has a huge amount of pride in what it's achieved and a strong cultural identification with upstream, largely offshore, technology-driven oil and gas. Understandably, that attachment to the company's roots was dominating Statoil's strategy and way of thinking. But large discoveries on the Norwegian continental shelf, were becoming fewer and far between, and many existing fields were in decline. At the same time, societal pressures to move to cleaner fuels was increasing. So could it be that their greatest historical strength would come to hold them back? Statoil's response was to execute a shift in how senior leaders think about the business by exploring emerging needs of society and how the company could deploy its strengths to meet those needs. So in other words, they defined themselves as something more than an oil and gas company and looked for the human problems that they could, with their huge and varied capabilities, work on solving next. So ultimately, this push resulted in the creation of a business unit called New Energy Solutions that would apply Statoil's capital and capabilities to low-carbon energy. The company expects 15 to 20% of its annual capital spending to be on renewables by 2030, and it's starting to make some bold bets in the space. Empire, its offshore wind project in New York, in the US, will cost $3 billion to build. That's in line with the scale of investment required to develop an oil and gas field in the North Sea. Another cool product of Statoil's increasing focus on problems it can help society solve is Hywind, a floating windmill that can be deployed in deep water. So here, the company is leveraging but redeploying its significant competence in high-risk, super high-complexity offshore environments. This could turn out to be really transformational. Up to 80% of the offshore wind resources are in waters too deep for bottom-fixed installations. The Hywind technology actually gives us a chance of exploiting the volume of offshore wind required by the 2-degree scenario. That's very important for us. And finally, this month, they plan to change their name. So from Statoil to Equinor. And for a company with this history, the significance of taking the word oil out of their name is very difficult to overstate. So my second example showing the potential of problems is an initiative called Vanguard. The Vanguard was launched 5 years ago in discussion with Paul Polman, the CEO of Unilever. Polman was discouraged that too few companies were showing leadership on the sustainability agenda, and he wanted allies. So this discussion has resulted in an annual program where 6 organizations, including MasterCard and the International Committee for the Red Cross, handpick senior leaders to join a collaborative, cross-company and cross-industry initiative to innovate commercial solutions to human problems, pooling their company's resources, capabilities, products, and services. It's been a steep learning curve for all involved, but they've achieved some pretty remarkable things. Last month in Istanbul, the Vanguard launched a program called Embark, which sees refugees from Syria mentoring business leaders in Turkey. My brother looked through my script a little earlier today, and he said, "Are you sure that the refugees from Syria are mentoring the business leaders?" I said, "Yes, that is correct." So in a world where many governments are fighting over who can accept the least number of refugees, focusing on the human problem has allowed these corporations to put themselves in a position where they're competing over who can absorb the most talent. So as one participant said, more people need to understand the caliber of talent represented by the refugee community. And given that the scarcest resource of all is human capital, where companies get this right, it's not only societies that become more resilient. Shareholders benefit too. So Unilever is, of course, a leading light in identifying commercial value in solving human problems. Its Shakti, Project Shakti, has trained a network of 72,000 micro-entrepreneurs in rural India, providing them with the skills they lacked and enabling them to participate meaningfully in the economy. In return, that network acts as a distribution and retail channel for Unilever and increases loyalty to the brand. So I made a reference earlier to Hans Rosling. He was immensely funny, and almost everything he said was incredibly memorable. But one of my favorites is when he said of himself, "I'm not an optimist. I'm a very serious possibilist." What he meant by this was not that we should be blindly positive, but that we should dare to be logical. that if we look at the facts and engage analytically with the world, we see that so much more is possible, that we have so much more power. Any perusal of the news today makes one feel as though we're living in a drought of many kinds, that we face acute shortages of resources, of money, of people, and of ideas. But that's actually not true at all. If you look at the facts, as Professor Rosling urged us to do, we see quite clearly that we actually live in an age of abundance. Just American companies alone have $1.3 trillion of cash on their balance sheets. And at the same time, we have never in history had access to so many educated minds. So we have the talent, we have the capital, and we have the ideas we need. But leaders are not focusing adequately on problems. So I hope that you will all leave here today with these three things. First, a new interest in problems. Second, a distrust for the O word, opportunity. 3, an even deeper respect for how you use your talent. It's precious. Use it wisely. Thank you very much.